Dungeons & Dragons is the most well-known tabletop role-playing game of all time. You can see it played anywhere from YouTube to prisons, among students, friends, colleagues, and sometimes even strangers on the internet. It is one of the oldest role-playing games out there, and it has influenced everyone that has come after it, on top of inspiring a few video games, animated shows, and movies. So I thought today we could delve into the core philosophy at the center of D&D to explore what the game's world does to reflect our own and how it can influence us players. I'm the Social Justice Game Master, and this is Review of the Month. Part 1: D&D's Power Creep and the Entrepreneurial Mindset. If you want to know what a game is trying to make you do as a player, look for what gives you rewards. For example, a game centered on roleplay and the concept of community like Urban Shadows will reward you with a power boost when you've interacted in a significant way with a member of each of the 4 factions. I've covered Urban Shadows on the channel in this video. This reward system produces dopamine in the brain and incentivizes you to repeat the actions that are beneficial to you and your character. In D&D, players are rewarded by the game mechanics with experience points and loot. Both of these can be obtained through combat, so naturally, players who want to get the rush of leveling up their characters and their gear will seek out combat more. This easily explains why some players turn into the infamous murder hobos. Adventurers in nothing but the name, this type of character will seek to slay and loot anything that crosses their path. And this can be quite a problem for game masters who want to keep some NPCs alive long enough to create a coherent setting and story. This problem is solved by other games that reward roleplay and story progression rather than just combat. Of course, if the game master sets up a story that is interesting enough, then players might feel rewarded for following it along, even if it isn't the one thing that will make them progress mechanically. But D&D is focused on combat as the core mechanical way to evolve your character and their stats. And that isn't surprising since D&D was heavily inspired by Chainmail, one of the first role-playing games that was mostly a battle simulator. But what are the consequences of these game mechanics? Well, simply put, it places the player characters in a cycle of violence and pillaging that only stops when they die or all those that they see as enemies are dead. This is interesting because there is a disturbing amount of parallels that can be established between the adventurer's mindset and the mindset of entrepreneurs in our world. And this has a big influence on the way players think, both in the game and outside of the game. I will now show what these similarities are and try to point out that they are generally creating a negative mood at the table. Indeed, most of the things I'm about to point out makes players less empathetic towards NPCs, the setting, and finally the story itself. They see it as resources from which they can profit instead of people in the story they are telling. Risks in exchange for rewards. Adventurers will often enter life-or-death situations in the hopes of coming out on the other side victorious and with more gold. Likewise, when a company attempts to grow, overtake the competition, or expand its reach, it is always taking a risk that could throw it into bankruptcy. And just like companies, a D&D group will often be richer for having survived a high-risk situation. Infinite progress? In theory. A game of D&D doesn't ever have to end. You can keep playing and keep getting better loot and better skills for as long as you like, but most people will end the game around the time that they reach the maximum level and defeat whatever villain the story was building to. After that, there isn't really anything else to fight or do unless your players want to murder all of the gods in existence and take their place. Likewise, companies under capitalism could in theory keep growing forever by merging with other companies and becoming megacorps like we are seeing today. Amazon and Disney are completely taking over their respective industries, online delivery and entertainment, but just like in D&D, this growth has a practical limit. At some point, you end up with more to sell than people are willing to buy. just like a D&D character inevitably ends up with gear that is way too expensive to even sell. Another practical limit is resources. On our small planet, there is only so much oil that the transport industry can sell you, and in D&D there are only so many monsters you can slay before you've exterminated them all. Survivorship bias. Another strange similarity between both mindsets is a bias that has ruined a lot of businesses throughout history. When people want to run a business, well, they tend to listen to the advice of those who have successfully created economical empires. You'll often hear advice like persevere no matter what from CEOs, or you'll often read misleading articles about things that successful people all have in common. The problem with this perspective is that it ignores completely the important lessons you can learn from those who have failed to reach the success they wanted. For every CEO that tells you to keep pushing, there are hundreds of people who kept trying until they bankrupted themselves. Behind every think piece on the morning rituals of successful people is the reality that most of us fail to reach what our society deems successful because we simply weren't born with the rich relatives like every single billionaire in existence. Starting businesses are more likely to fail and go bankrupt than we like to admit, and most of us can't get back up from the ensuing paralyzing debt like a rich person could. So when we listen to advice from those at the top, we're really listening to how they managed to beat a game where most players end up in terrible defeat. D&D adventurers are much the same when they go adventuring, with their heads full of legends of past heroes. Bards are unlikely to sing about the thousands who died storming a dungeon, but you'll surely hear about the ones who made it to the treasure. That's survivor bias. And D&D player characters have a safety net similar to the rich in our world. Your adventurer is unlikely to come across a challenge that you have no chance of conquering. The Game Master is invested in the party's survival in order to continue the story, and so they aren't going to make you fight monsters that are way above your ability to kill. But there are other adventurers out there, and lots of them are going to end up dying to a dragon who is 7 levels stronger than them. Escape from consequences. Heroes in D&D don't have to face the problems that an adventurer's lifestyle usually comes with. Thanks to the existence of healing potions and resurrection spells, player characters rarely have to endure injuries or death for very long. This means that at higher levels, these characters are likely to have a certain aloofness towards death and other problems that can be devastating to mere mortals. Big corporations also end up with similar protections when they become too big to fail. They will be able to get away with breaking the law by hiding it or paying fees that are inconsequential to them. They would also be able to endure a major economic crisis by firing a few scapegoats, just like the banks did during the housing market crisis of 2008. The justification. Becoming the biggest and the best is the name of the game. In D&D, players can justify the need to gain experience and loot in an eternal cycle of violence because there are always stronger and bigger threats on the horizon. If your party defeats a level 7 dragon, even if it is the last of its kind, it is justified since the next session you are going to face off against a level 8 vampire lord that's attacking the town, and you're going to have to use the loot from the dragon's horde. In our world, the capitalist mindset is that you're a winner if you have a ton of money, so it seems like an end goal for most people who are playing the game. The problem is that this race for wealth is leading capitalists to destroy the planet for profit. The most powerful economically in our world make their fortunes by cutting corners and using cheap, polluting materials and paying their workers as little as possible. The same thing is likely to happen in a D&D game if you keep playing after the players reach their max level and kill the setting's bad guys. What I'm trying to say here is that the game mechanics in D&D lead us to focus on aspects of the story that are deeply capitalistic. Your goal is to get more gold to improve the skills that allow you to get even more gold. And when you consider the source materials that inspire D&D, it's really weird how we got to that point. Part 2. A Capitalist's Fantasy. Dragons, Nordic Gold, and the Hobbit. The biggest inspiration for the setting of D&D is clearly the universe that Tolkien created when he started writing The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien created a universe based on the mythological creatures and legends of Northern Europe. In doing so, he borrowed some of the themes from these stories, one of which happens to be greed. In The Song of the Nibelungs, an ancient Norse saga, the characters become involved in a destructive plot to obtain the legendary gold of the Nibelungs. This enchanted gold, and the ring that is forged out of it, is extremely desirable to anyone who sets eyes upon it. The different gods, dwarves, and humans who try to possess the gold at any cost set in motion the catastrophic events that cause Ragnarok, the end of the world. Tolkien had a very similar object with his One Ring that causes extreme greed in those who are near it and who want the ring at all cost. On top of that, The Hobbit is a cautionary tale against the dangers of greed, which the characters refer to as dragon sickness. We see good characters turn sour and warlike when wealth is concerned, and the moral of that story is that lives are worth more than gold. So how did those stories end up inspiring a game like Dungeons & Dragons? Well, it has to do with the medium. A game has to be fun and rewarding, so the creators established rewards for fighting without necessarily thinking about what sort of philosophy would emerge from this game mechanic. A game based on the philosophy of The Hobbit instead of the setting of The Hobbit would reward players for abandoning wealth and violence in favor for a good life, but most adventurers in D&D never reach the point where this becomes a meaningful choice. This led to a shift in philosophy, and that changed the image that we have of dragons. These enormous boss-like creatures sleeping on mountains of gold were a good symbol for fruitless greed in the Song of the Nibelungs. But in D&D, they are an obstacle to overcome in order to obtain more riches. In that sense, the player characters who seek out dragons to murder and steal from them are more like Smaug and Fafnir, the greedy dragons, than the dragons in D&D themselves. This also moves the focus away from real-life dragons. Yes, I'm talking about dragons here on Earth. And no, it's not the Komodo dragons or these little fellas. It's the guys sitting on massive piles of gold when they could be using it to solve world hunger. That's right. We're talking about billionaires. The reason dragons are the bad guys in so many stories is because they hoard insane amounts of wealth and often kill people for that wealth. Well, billionaires do the exact same thing. They hoard insane amounts of money that could end climate change, world hunger, and poverty by taking profit from their workers' wages. And we often have a hard time visualizing how much money $1 billion is. It is such a large amount of money that our brains need a visual comparison in order to get it. I often like to tell people to think of dollars as seconds. The median American has $7,000 in their bank accounts in 2016, and 7,000 seconds is 2 hours. A millionaire would have 11 days in seconds, and a billionaire would have 31 years. But let's do this comparison with a dragon horde. The price of gold per ton is $58,739,000. So, if a billionaire was to transform all of their assets into gold, they could get a 2,000 tons ship like this, made entirely of gold, 10 times. That is a ridiculous amount of money, and no one should be allowed to own this much while there are people in the world without food or homes. The richest man in the world right now is Jeff Bezos, and he has hoarded 176 billion. That's 1,760 ships like this, just made entirely of gold. If there was a dragon out there with that much money, we would kill it instantly to redistribute the money to the people. But we don't with billionaires? That's actually so wild to me. Instead, we praise them for creating jobs when all they really do is exploit the workers by paying them scraps of the value they produce. Anyways, let's get back to D&D. We can now see that there is a complete disconnect between the stories that inspired D&D and the current capitalist philosophy it upholds. By having so much of the focus be on the rewards that are coming from the cycle of violence and the loot that you're selling back, players are encouraged to repeat those actions without necessarily thinking of the consequences. Just like billionaires keep amassing wealth when that is clearly destroying the planet. But there are simple ways to fix those issues, at least in D&D. We haven't found a good solution to billionaires other than eat the rich. Part 3. EasyFixes. Now that we know there is a strong underlying capitalist philosophy in D&D, we can talk about changing the mechanics to change that philosophy. If you want to push your players to not become murder hobos, it's an easy fix. It's the same thing if you don't want to glorify capitalism in your games and treat your adventurers like entrepreneurs. First off, there's the milestone system that has appeared with D&D 5th edition, where your characters don't get experience from fighting monsters, but they level up when they have reached a certain point in the story and their development where it makes sense for them to grow stronger. This shifts the priority away from fighting and towards the story, so that's a good step. You can also shape your stories to talk about the problems of using violence to solve every situation, just like I did in one of my D&D one-shots. Click on the top right corner if you want to check that out. On top of the milestone system, you can create other mechanics that reward roleplay, de-escalating violence, and alternatives to violence, and the search for a peaceful life. You can use magic items that are corruptive to show that the path of ever-increasing power leads to ruin. You'd have to avoid all of the non-corruptive magic items that are all over D&D. Also, if you have a story structure that makes your players care about other characters than their own, then that's also a good way to do things. Imagine having a generational game of D&D where after every scenario your player characters retire from their lives of violence and the players play their characters' children in the next scenario many years later. This structure makes your players think a little bit more about the kind of world they would leave behind them after each adventure ends. You could also adapt the lore to have the setting not be capitalist. For example, in an anarcho-communist society, villagers would have a shared pool of magic items they use for the community. Adventurers who pass by and help with monster problems could have the objects lent to them if they leave behind a guarantee that they will return the artifacts. In this case, you could forego the entire money system of D&D and imagine with your players what a society could be like without money. God knows we need more stories like these nowadays, because the more popular these stories are, the more likely they are to become a reality in our world. This has been my review of the month. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and click the bell button for more content like this.